Hi there. Thank you very much for giving your time for this final webinar before we actually meet in person. Um, so, let's start. What we're trying to do here in this webinar is obviously we're not going to create our group and create all our open learning at this point while you're on a computer and I'm in front of a camera. But what we do want to do is kind of hit the ground running with the basics of what we want to get trained in or get aware of when you come to Israel. One of our key assumptions about why it is difficult or challenging to have conversations about Israel which dig into the tough stuff is because it is also difficult to dig into the tough stuff about anything these days in the United States. So this photograph is a case in point. This is a picture, obviously, as you're probably familiar with, President Trump meeting with the G7. Now, the key thing with this photograph is that whoever you speak to who has some stake in the politics of the United States, that person will tell you that this picture says it all. The picture says it all. The only difficulty is that different people mean totally different things by saying it all. Because your classic President Trump resistor will look at that photograph and will tell you, this says it all. This tells you exactly why President Trump is getting everything wrong. Everything wrong. And at the same time, your President Trump supporter will point to that photograph and will tell you exactly the same thing except the opposite. This photo is a perfect explanation as to how President Trump is getting everything right. So here is our dilemma, or our challenge. First of all, how can I have a conversation with somebody when we understand totally different things about the same picture? There is no possibility for any kind of meeting of minds, and so every conversation becomes a shouting match, or I'll just step out. The second challenge is, even if we do enter into this shouting match, the chances are that I will judge your personality according to your opinion. And I am worried that you will judge my personality according to my opinion, which means that the stakes, the social stakes of a conversation are much higher, because not only might I lose the argument, I might also lose a friend. What we're going to try and do while we're spending our time in Israel is to tackle both these aspects, the way that we can have a constructive conversation about difficult stuff, and the way that we can have a conversation with somebody without hating them. Okay? First step is to begin to look at what our assumption is what are in the guts of most people in the United States. What are we mostly thinking about these days? So this is an an exercise that we've done across the English-speaking world and in Israel as well with young adults. It's a very, very straightforward exercise that we're going to do. It's going to be a strange kind of exercise because it won't be a dialogue. I'm going to kind of imagine what you're going to tell me. But before we do that, I'd just like us to do a short private exercise which we will return to. Really, really quick. You can press pause if you'd like. I'd like you to write down for yourself, we'll return to this, write down for yourself one thing that you love about Israel, one thing that frustrates you about Israel, and one thing that confuses you about Israel. Okay? One thing you love about Israel, one thing that frustrates you about Israel, one thing that you love about Israel. Write that down, mark that down, we'll return to it. We're kind of marking our Israel place because now we're going to move into the realm of the world without Israel. We went around the English-speaking world in Israel asking one relatively simple question. What is bothering you in the world apart from entertainments and sports? And leave aside the Jews and Israel. So nothing to do with Jews and Israel, nothing to do with sports or entertainments. I know it's the World Cup, so we've got to put that aside. apart from sports, entertainments, what's in your feed? What's on your mind? And what would happen is that people would just shout out stuff and we scribbled them on the whiteboard, which is why I'm in front of the whiteboard now. I'm going to scribble out stuff which has generally been shouted out. The chances are it's stuff that you might also shout out. If it doesn't involve stuff that you might shout out, my apologies. This is the nature of a non-dialogical presentation. I got my marker, and so for example, some people will shout out stuff to do with gun control. Gun control. There's also stuff to do with, the latest stuff is of course immigration. Some people will shout out stuff about Me Too. Other things that might arise, climate change. Corruption. That used to be just an Israeli challenge, but I think it's an American one too. Well, probably when we're on that one, quite often people just shout out Trump, and we don't quite know what they mean, or we need them to specify. So one aspect would be about freedom of speech. Then there'd be the media. There'd be North Korea. Nukes. Black Lives Matter. That certainly used to be a bigger thing. If we're talking about this, just in general, there'd be racism, nationalism. Okay, what else would be going on? Probably people would also talk about refugees. What else? Probably healthcare. How do you spell that? H-E, healthcare. Gun control. But what else would be going on? There'd be something about probably something about democracy, really. Quite a few people are expressing concerns about democracy, and certainly liberal democracy is a concern for people. Democracy generally is somewhat fragile these days. LGBTQ. Oh yeah, you could go for, apropos the photo that we looked at just before, America First. That would probably, cover our sort of general gathering of ills in the world, or what's bothering me, what's on my feed. And so we generally get the same kind of picture, the same kind of shout-outs wherever we've been going over the last few years, which is suggesting to us that roughly these are the things that most people, at least that we work with, are concerned about, not necessarily pointing out what their opinion is about these concerns, but what they are concerned about. And then, maybe we'll put in terrorism as well. That used to come up quite a bit. And then, what we suddenly realised was that these concerns can be clustered. These concerns can be gathered into roughly 4 kinds of groups. It's not science, it's not exact, but roughly speaking, you can kind of divide up these shout-outs into 4 clusters. So that, roughly speaking, you can roughly do this with a crap marker pen. Roughly, you can divide things like that. And so then, roughly speaking, you begin to get a picture of 4 key areas of concern that seem to be in common pretty much around the world. One area of concern, drop my marker pen, one area of concern, this area, the gun control, nukes, Black Lives Matter, North Korea, terrorism, you might also have the Syrian war, etc. It's something about how do we stay safe. How do we stay safe? This seems to be a recurring concern. Over here, these seem to be questions of belonging, of collective identity. If it's to do with racism or exceptionalism, who's in and who's out. These all seem to be questions that are rising more and more and more across the world. Something to do with the question of who are we? Who are we? And how should we behave? We Americans, we Brits, we Europeans. The British are asking, are we European or are we just British? The Scottish are asking, are we British or just Scottish? Everybody's asking these questions about who are we. The word un-American seems to come up all the time, which suggests that there's a question mark about what it is to be American. Like what is un-American behavior or beliefs or values? What means that suddenly we're not American anymore, we don't recognize ourselves? Are there ways in which we behave towards Americans that need to be different from the ways in which we behave to people who are not American? These questions of collective identity, belonging, loyalty, values seem to be in question. Down here, the question of free speech and the media and corruption and liberal democracy, this seems to be something to do with freedom. The question seems to be, how can we maintain our freedoms? And finally, this area of immigration and climate change and refugees seems to be all about territory. How do I mark my territory? What are my borders? Who crosses my borders? Who do I allow to cross my borders? First of all, who puts the borders there? Who polices the border? Who is allowed to cross the border? Who's not allowed to cross the border? And what happens when we have money? Does that cross the border more freely than human beings? Certainly carbon emissions cross borders far easier than human beings do, and so that even calls into question the idea of territory altogether. 4 big areas of concern that all of us have some kind of gut responses to. These 4 areas of concern, they are what we're going to be focusing on. So, with these key questions going on, a way of encapsulating it would be to ask the painful question for some. Looking at these 4 questions about America, how can we stay safe? Who are we and how should we behave? How can we maintain our freedoms, and how should we relate to our territory? Ask yourself, how did President Obama tend to answer these 4 questions? And how does President Trump tend to answer these 4 questions? The chances are that you've suddenly come up with 2 sets of totally diametrically opposed answers to the same questions, which tells us 2 things. First of all, it kind of gives us an understanding of why there's such a political schism in the United States right now. But it also gives us a smidgen of hope, because what it also says to us is that we agree about what we argue over. We agree about what we argue over. These 4 areas of concerns are shared concerns. Our challenge is that we have different responses, remedies, answers to these 4 concerns, in particular when they're in tension one with the other. So for example, we had healthcare, which is somewhere in the middle, because healthcare is certainly something to do with, am I concerned about the people? Am I concerned about us? Should everybody get healthcare because everybody is American? Or is it something to do with freedom, as in we should all be free to take whatever health insurance we wish and not be forced to pay for it? So it's a little bit about that. It's obviously a little bit about life and death occasionally, and it also, your healthcare depends upon which area you tend to live in the United States. And in Britain and in other parts of the world, healthcare and the balance between these questions shifts. So, what on earth does this have to do with Israel? Well, looking at these 4 questions, we realized that what we can do is we can map onto these 4 questions 4 Hebrew words. 4 Hebrew words, which roughly speaking map onto these 4 questions. I'll first of all write them in English and then in Hebrew. But it basically goes to be a people free in our land. To be a people free in our land, and in Hebrew, להיות עם חופשי בארצנו. And if these 4 words are familiar to you, that probably makes sense because they are the words of the penultimate line of the Israeli national anthem, Hatikva, the hope. להיות עם חופשי בארצנו. Okay? So, להיות עם חופשי בארצנו is a way of us relating to these 4 questions, and that we can begin to see that in Israel, similar and totally different to the United States, in Israel we are also addressing 4 key questions. Lihiyot, to be. How can we survive and stay safe? How can we be a people? What unites us? What makes the Jews work and not work? Hofshi, freedom, our democracy, liberal democracy. How does that work in Israel and in our land, Be'artzeinu? What do we do with this specific piece of land in this particular piece of the world? So what we've got now is that we've got a kind of a definition of what we might call liberal nationalism means, for want of a better word, and there are probably better ways of putting it. But generally speaking, this idea of to be a people free in our land is a relatively universal aspiration. Like, for example, the Kurds are fighting to be the Kurdish people free in the land of Kurdistan. The Catalonians are struggling to be the Catalonian people free in the land of Catalonia. The Scots had a choice, a referendum, whether they wanted to be the Scottish people free in the land of Scotland. The Palestinians will talk about wanting to be a Palestinian people free in the land of Palestine, and we, the Jews, the people of Israel, want to continue to be the people of Israel free in the land of Israel. And right there, you have the picture of where there is consensus and where there is disagreement. Right from the very beginning, hang on a minute, it's our land, and at the same time, exactly the same geographical space is regarded as our land by a totally different people. And how do those 2 things fit together? What happens when my land is also your land? And then we begin to dig into the nature of these 4 areas of argument, where it is that it's legitimate, healthy, and even interesting to argue, disagree, dig into, explore key questions about what Israel is about, which is also a little bit what America is about, asking questions about safety in Israel. I'm fine with saying we want Israel to be safe. The question is how? Should we have more weapons? Should we have less weapons? Should we make more peace, less peace? More defensive weapons, more offensive weapons? How? How should the Jewish people play out in this country? Should it be more orthodox, less orthodox, more pluralistic, less pluralistic, more open to people who are not Jewish, less open to people who are not Jewish, etc.? How should this play out? How should Jewish values live out in the country? We want Israel to be a democracy, but in what kind of a democracy? Should it be a liberal democracy? Should it be more liberal? Should it be more democratic? If it gets too democratic and less liberal, then we end up with Turkey. If it gets so liberal that far more liberal but not all that democratic, we end up with the European Union. Like, what What does democracy mean, and what happens with the rights and the freedoms and the democratic expectations of a people who we are maintaining their lack of freedom? And finally, our land. Biggest question of all, where are the borders of our land? Who makes that decision? What happens when our land is somebody else's land? What do we mean by our land? Do we mean our land like our apartment or our car? Is it property? Or do we mean our land like our family, our friends? That would be relational. Do we need to be in our land to feel that it's ours? I'm filming this from where I live, which is up in the north of Israel. Can I see Hebron as ours, as mine, even if I'm not living in Hebron? Can you, living in New Jersey, see Israel as your land? How does all that kind of stuff work? So these are the big questions that we would suggest. It's kind of like this. It goes, I think the phrase would be irreducible and unavoidable. You can't reduce Israel down to these 4 questions. It's far more alive and more interesting and more weird and complicated. And at the same time, it's unavoidable. Like, if you don't get a handle of these 4 questions, I think you've missed Israel. If you don't get that every Israeli is either neurotic about or in denial of existential threats, you've missed Israel. If you ignore the fact that there are deep questions of the future of the Jewish people bound up in the nature of this country, you've missed Israel. If you ignore the fact that Israel is meant to be and should continue to be a thriving democracy, whilst also fragile, you've missed Israel if you ignore the democratic question, and you've missed Israel if you kind of pretend that it's in a different part of the world. These are the 4 essential questions that we're going to be digging into. So looking at these 4 questions, we have the 4 Hatikva questions. Okay, this is where 4HQ comes in. The H is from Hatikva, or hope. The 4 questions from Hatikva. The 4 Hatikva questions, 4HQ. 4HQ is going to be one of our tools as we spend our time together over this year in Israel with your mentors in the retreat. 4HQ is going to be our kind of chip in the head, our way of listening and our way of analysing how we feel about stuff and how we can explain stuff and open conversations about stuff through the 4 Hatikva questions. Blink. So we can stick the 4HQ chip in our heads, thinking about stuff that's going on in Israel. In particular, let's first of all apply these 4 Hatikva questions to the conflict. This is a cartoon created by Shai Chauka. He's a religious settler living in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. And this is one of his cartoons where he has his kind of alter ego, Charter. Charter would say that he is an Israeli Jew living in Judea, sitting and having a conversation with his friend Ahmed. Ahmed would tell you that he is sitting having a coffee with his friend, sitting in occupied Palestine, the West Bank. And Ahmed says, how is it that we can sit here drinking coffee together while our 2 nations can't stop fighting each other? And Charter says, wow, man. Says Ahmed, it's all because of politics. Believe me, if me and you were in charge, there'd already be peace. And then we get the key vision of peace coming from these 2 characters sitting having a coffee. Says Ahmed, if I were in charge, I'd bring you all into Islam and we'd live here like brothers. And the vision of peace coming from Charter. And I'd give Jordan to you guys so you could turn it into a democratic Palestinian state like you learnt from us. Check that out, says Ahmed. There could have already been peace. Wow, man. So it's a fascinating cartoon. First of all, because it has these 2 characters giving us their vision of peace, when each vision is probably the way that the Third World War might well begin. Each vision of peace is completely contradictory to the other one. And at the same time, if ever you wanted an image of peace between the Jews and the Palestinians, well then the Jew and the Arab sitting in the land having a coffee together, having a chat, probably not a bad image of peace. But now let's, whilst bearing in mind that these are cartoon characters with cartoon opinions, let's nevertheless see how 4HQ helps us make a little bit of sense of the way in which they're able to, in this occasion, totally agree with each other whilst completely disagreeing at the same time. What did Ahmed say? If I were in charge, I'd bring you all into Islam and we'd live here like brothers. So we will live, we will be, obviously you'll not be Jewish. Let's assume that you became Muslim out of your own free will and you can stay here. So you get 3 out of 4. 3 out of 4. What did Charter have to say in response? Charter's response is, I'd give Jordan to you guys so you could turn it into a democratic Palestinian state like you learned from us. So you can live, you can be Palestinian, you can be democratic, just not here. Again, 3 out of 4. Moving beyond the cartoon characters into real life, we could think about what Tzipi Livni has often said, that Israel must promote a process of 2 separate nation states. This also includes giving up the right of the Jewish people to certain parts of the land of Israel. So what she's saying we should both be. We should both be our own nation states. We should both be democratic, I'm assuming. And we need to divide the land. We could move to the late Edward Said, talks about sharing the land in a truly democratic way with equal rights for all citizens. So he's suggesting we should live. The concept of separate nation states is off the table, and that way, only in that way, can we be democratic and free, as in the only way we can be democratic is to change the understanding of what the demos is, and then we can all be and share the land. Different ways of taking these 4 questions and seeing how they play out in real life, and how these 4 questions can be a way for us to listen to what's being said and begin to pass our understandings of it so we can move from our gut feeling into an area of inquiry. Let's think about women at the wall. Women at the wall. So certainly this is an issue of peoplehood, isn't it? This is about being Jewish and the place of different kinds of pluralistic kinds of Jews in different places. But at the same time, it's also about freedom. On the one hand, it's about the freedom to worship wherever one wants. And from the Haredi point of view, it's about the freedom to worship in the way in which one wants, which is not to have women wearing talitot next to where the Haredim are praying. But this is also an issue of land, because had we not conquered Jerusalem, this question would not be an issue at all, as in the fact that we actually are sovereign over Jerusalem leads to the possibility of having these arguments about what we do with this particular piece of land. And then also we need to remember that there was a war fought for this place. Not only was there a war fought for this place, but there is a willingness to fight other wars for this place, that this place is seen as worthy of risking one's life for it. Just to play at it, here's an issue which is being dealt with in Israel and in the United States, and it would seem, depending on who you listen to, that there is deep unhappiness about the way in which here in Israel African refugees are welcomed or not welcomed, and in the United States the way immigration, be that refugees or economic migrants, how that's working out as well. What's this a question of? I mean, when we think about immigration, well, first of all, this is a question about who the people are, as in, what happens to America, for example, when the majority of Americans speak Spanish? What does that do to this feeling of what it is to be American? I'm exaggerating these things, of course. Same in Israel. What happens when a certain number of immigrants and refugees arrive in Israel such that the majority is altered? The same questions are happening across Europe. And at the same time, who are we, Americans, who are we Jews, if we do not welcome those who need welcoming? What on earth is it to be American if we don't look to the Statue of Liberty and give them some huddled masses stuff? It's also, some would say, this is a question of a nation's survival. President Trump will certainly talk about how that there are dangerous people crossing the borders. And so maybe it's a question of survival, of safety, of security. By other terms, it may be that we are making life more difficult with being lenient on immigration. It's certainly a question of freedom on the one hand, the freedom of movement, the freedom for people to live where they want to live. And at the same time, it's probably also a question of democratic choices. What laws do we have? What laws should we have? What laws might we yet make in order to ensure freedom for all? And how will immigration, how will refugees affect the makeup of our democratic structures? Likewise, it's certainly a matter of land because it's about our borders, who crosses our borders, who doesn't cross our borders, and whether we should protect our borders or not. Another hot topic in the United States, unfortunately, would be the matter of gun control, the right to bear arms. So what's this about if it's not about security, about safety? And of course, it depends on whose side you're on. One might say we need more gun controls in order for us to feel more safe, whilst others would say, I need more guns in order for me to feel safe so that I can defend myself. There'll be others who say, it's my freedom, it's an essential American freedom that I should be able to bear arms. And others will say, but it's also my freedom to go to school without being shot. Others will say, it's what it is to be American. We have to have arms. It's what it is. It's sacred. This sacred amendment is what's sacred to what it is to be American. The others would say, yes, but this is the very worst thing about America, is that we have so many arms and so many killings. And certainly the situation shifts from state to state in the United States. And of course, in comparison to the way things work in the United States, and in other countries. Again, another way that these four questions are always playing through our lives. So, assignment number 1. You remember that you wrote down for yourself, one thing that I love about Israel, one thing that frustrates me about Israel, and one thing that confuses me about Israel? So now your task is as follows. This is task number 1. You'll find on the Google folder, you'll find the photograph of this chart of to be a people free in our land. What I'd like you to do is take your 3 comments, what I love, frustrates me and confuses me, and see whether you can put these comments in the most appropriate place. Okay? For example, easy example, if what I love about Israel is the view of Jerusalem from the Tayelet, okay, that would strike me pretty much is about our land. Okay, so I would write down here, the view of the Tayelet is what I love. Okay, that would be in that position. Okay, if what I love about Israel is how free everybody is, and then I'd go over here. If what I love about Israel is the sexy soldiers, then that might be over here, or it might be to do with the people as well. Put the 3 comments onto the chart of the 4 Hatikva questions. I've put it up there in a Word document, in a JPG and a PDF, so that should be available for all of you. Ideally, please write down and place your comments on the chart and then upload them back onto the document. That way we can print them out for you, because we're going to be using your charts. We're going to be using these charts in the first session that we have in Suba on the first day. Okay? If you don't manage to upload it within a week of coming out to Israel, please print it out for yourself and bring it with you. We are all of us, every single person who is going to be on the trip, all participants, mentors, and staff, we need you to fill out this chart so that we can use it in the opening session. That's assignment number 1. The second question, which we'd like you to write onto the Google chart that we have on the website as well, and the links are there. What tends to happen in life is that we become stronger, more used to addressing certain of these concerns and less concerned about different areas. I'll give you an example. Generally speaking, what we've found is that when we talk to Jewish institutions, we tend to say to them, you can come up with whatever answers that you want, but if you want to talk about Israel, you need to talk about all 4 questions. And then we find that generally speaking, a left-leaning organization talks a lot about freedom, not a lot about security. And we find that right-leaning organizations talk a lot about safety and the land, but not much about freedom, in particular the freedom of Palestinians. We don't care what stance any of you take, or any of these organizations, but we do want to make sure that you are expert at addressing all 4 questions. And our expertise tends to come from our gut instincts. Our gut instincts, so the question is, which we'd like you to write down, in your gut, which of these 4 areas of concern do you tend to concentrate on when you think about America? And which of these 4 questions do you tend to concentrate on when you think about Israel? We tend to think all of us have our tendencies. It will be useful for us to begin to pinpoint, first of all, what are my tendencies? Because that's going to be the beginning of the job to turn our gut instincts into areas for exploration, areas for inquiry. And the more we're able to shift our perspective from gut instinct to area of inquiry, the more we're able to build the possibility of discourse and community. And then once we suss it in ourselves, then we need to develop tools to enable all participants, all visitors to Moishe House events, so that also for them, we can empower them to recognize their gut instincts and open them up to become an area of inquiry. See you soon.